In the limestone hills above an old caravan road, there is a collapsed watchtower the locals call the Ear of God. They say a man named Ilias lived there for decades without speaking a syllable to another human being. At dusk, shepherds would set bread and figs by the doorway. By dawn, the bowl was empty, and in its place lay thin strips of parchment, inked in a hand so fine it looked like smoke. They weren't sermons. They weren't warnings. They were love letters, addressed to no one, signed by no name. Each one began the same: to the one who hides inside my absence. When Ilias finally came down, beard silvered, eyes steady, the elders asked, "What did you find up there, alone with nothing but wind?" He smiled and answered, "Loneliness is not the lack of the beloved. It is the beloved's grip, tight enough to break the false self." Tonight, we enter that tower to study the hidden craft of solitude. Through Maulana Jalal's Masnavi, Farid's Conference of the Birds, and Carl Gustav's Red Book, we live in an age that fears quiet. Silence feels like a malfunction. The moment a room becomes still, we reach for a screen the way an anxious hand reaches for a cigarette. But the old traditions insisted on something that modern life keeps forgetting. There is a loneliness that starves you, and there is a loneliness that initiates you. Rumi hints at this in the Masnavi when he describes the soul's strange education, how every loss is also a refinement, a stripping down toward what is real. And Jung, writing about his descent into inner images, describes a season where the outer world becomes thin, and the psyche begins to speak in symbols, dreams, moods, synchronicities, sudden terrors that arrive without a visible cause. This is where most people panic and run back to noise. But the mystic and the depth psychologist both say, don't run, because solitude is not emptiness. It is a furnace. It burns away borrowed identities, the performer, the pleaser, the addict to approval. In that heat, habits you thought were you reveal themselves as defenses, sedatives against the soul's deeper demand. So the question changes. Not how do I escape loneliness, but what is loneliness trying to extract from me? In the Sufi imagination, there is a memory older than your biography. Before you had a name, before you learned your face in mirrors, the soul belonged, the way a drop belongs to the sea, not separate, not anxious, not performing. Then comes incarnation, the descent into distinction. You are poured into a body, pinned to a story, trained to say, I am this, and I am not that. And with that training, a new ache is born. The ache of separation. Rumi uses a language of dying and becoming. Mineral to plant, plant to animal, animal to human. Each transformation a small death. But behind all those is a first death. The loss of original union. And that first death leaves a signature in the nervous system. It's why comfort can feel addictive. It's why distraction feels like salvation. We are homesick without knowing for what. Jung saw the same pattern from another angle. In myths and dreams, he noticed a recurring image, a primordial wholeness broken into opposites. Consciousness awakens, and suddenly the human being knows it is human. The world is no longer seamless. I stands over here and Leaf stands over there. Loneliness, then, is not only social, it's ontological. The soul realizing it has been cut from its own depth. And here the paradox sharpens. The very wound of separation becomes the engine of return. Loneliness hurts because it is a kind of remembering, is the soul's alarm bell. You are living too far from the source. Attar tells this with surgical beauty in the Conference of the Birds. Thousands of birds gather, restless and exhausted, each trapped in its own excuses. They want a king to save them, something higher, something final, something that will end their inner fracture. And so they depart to find the Simurgh. But the road is not a road of comfort. It is a road of subtraction. They cross 7 valleys. The search that burns up certainty, the love that dismantles calculation, the knowledge that humiliates pride, the detachment that breaks addiction, the unity that dissolves categories, the bewilderment where the mind fails, and finally poverty and annihilation, where even the seeker is consumed. In the end, only 30 birds arrive, and when they see the Simurgh, they discover the brutal joke. Simurgh is sea morgue, 30 birds. The king was never out there. The king was what remained after everything false fell away. Loneliness is one of those valleys. It is not punishment. It is the thinning of the crowd so the self can finally be seen. Alchemy begins the same way, with darkness. Not the poetic kind, the real kind. The old texts call it NIGREDO, blackening, rot, the breakdown of the familiar form. The prima materia is put into the vessel and heated until it can no longer pretend to be stable. It collapses into chaos. This is why the great work looks, from the outside, like a crisis. Jung took this literally. He read the alchemists not as primitive chemists, but as explorers of the psyche. Their Iliad was the unworked soul. Their goal was wholeness. And NIGREDO, that black stage, was the encounter with the shadow. Everything you have disowned and buried to remain acceptable. Rage you call stress. Envy you call motivation. Desire you call weakness. Grief you call tiredness. In ordinary life, we keep the shadow sedated with movement, social noise, productivity, romance, constant entertainment. But loneliness removes the anesthetic. In solitude, the shadow rises like smoke from the floorboards. You don't become worse. You simply lose the distractions that kept you from seeing what was already there. This is why loneliness feels unbearable at first. It is the psyche demanding honesty. Notice how loneliness targets habits, not randomly, strategically. The more unconscious the habit, the louder it becomes in silence. The hand reaches for the phone without permission. The mind starts replaying humiliations from 10 years ago. The body craves sugar, porn, chaos, anything with a quick spike of sensation. People call this boredom. But boredom is often just the shadow knocking on the door. Jung's line in Man and His Symbols becomes practical here. The psyche speaks in images when the ego refuses truth. In loneliness, those images intensify. Dreams become vivid, symbols repeat, old memories return with theatrical force. The unconscious is saying, if you won't listen during daylight, I'll speak at night. And Rumi would add, this is not cruelty, it is guidance. The soul is being trained like a falcon, pulled away from cheap food so it can remember the taste of the wild. The pain is withdrawal from the false beloveds, approval, constant novelty, easy comfort. So the first discipline of alchemical loneliness is simple but brutal. Stay in the room, not forever, not as punishment, but long enough for the nervous system to stop bargaining, long enough for the psyche to reveal what it has been hiding beneath your routines. This is why the hermit story matters. Not because you should abandon society, but because the image is archetypal. The one who goes up the mountain is the part of you that refuses to keep living on borrowed definitions. In Jung's memories, dreams, reflections, he describes periods where he felt cut off from ordinary life, not as depression, but as a necessary distancing, a psychic winter that made room for something new. When the outer world becomes thin, the inner figures become real. Jung meets presences: old man, child, serpent, warrior, each a fragment of the psyche demanding recognition. The modern person calls this overthinking. Jung calls it confrontation, a dialogue with what you have refused to become. And in Sufi language, this stripping is tajrid, becoming bare. The soul is pulled away from attachments the way a bandage is pulled from skin, painful but clarifying. Loneliness exposes the costume. I am successful. I am lovable. I am strong. These are not lies, but they are incomplete. They become prisons when you cling to them for identity. So solitude performs a sacrifice. It kills the persona's constant performance. No audience, no applause, no social mirror. And without that mirror, the ego panics, because it realizes it doesn't know who it is without reflection. Here is the hidden turn. When the social mirror disappears, a deeper mirror appears. At first, it's merciless. You see your dependence, your hunger to be chosen, your fear of being ordinary. You see how many bad habits are not pleasures at all, but sedatives, tiny rituals to avoid meeting yourself. This is why loneliness is an initiation. It forces an encounter with the inner tyrant and the inner orphan. The tyrant says, "Produce or you are nothing." The orphan says, "If I'm alone, I will die." Both are old. Both are loud. And both can only be disarmed by presence. Attar's birds lose companions one by one. Not because companionship is evil, but because the seeker must discover what remains when supports collapse. Jung would call this the beginning of individuation. The ego stops outsourcing its center. And then, almost imperceptibly, something changes. The silence stops feeling like a courtroom and starts feeling like a temple. Not because you fixed yourself, but because you stopped running. The shadow, once met, loses its demonic glamour. It becomes information. It becomes energy. What was repressed returns as fuel. Creativity, honesty, boundaries, courage. In alchemy, after the blackening comes a whitening, albedo. The substance begins to clarify. The smoke thins. The mind becomes less hysterical. You start hearing something underneath anxiety, a quieter intelligence. The albedo is not happiness. It is cleansing. The psyche, having survived the night, begins to reorganize. In Jung's language, this is where opposites start to speak to each other instead of trying to woo one another. Reason and instinct, tenderness and strength, devotion and skepticism. The alchemists called the goal of this stage the conjunctio, the sacred marriage, not romance. Integration, the inner masculine and feminine, the conscious and unconscious, the seeker and the feared thing, begin to form a living pact. You are still alone, but the loneliness is different. It is no longer an empty hunger. It becomes solitude, a fullness that doesn't need immediate relief. Rumi describes this shift with that shocking line: the lovers don't finally meet somewhere. They are in each other all along. In practical terms, the beloved you chased in people, in praise, in distraction, was always a displaced longing for the self, your deeper totality, the hidden center. And now, because you have stopped begging the world to complete you, you can finally meet the world without violence, without grasping, without the constant demand. Fix me. Validate me. Rescue me. This is the moment bad habits weaken, not by willpower, but by irrelevance. When you are internally accompanied, You need fewer substitutes. Now the work becomes surgical. Because once solitude appears, you begin to notice the exact mechanics of your old patterns. Loneliness showed you the symptom. Solitude shows you the structure. Watch how the habit begins. A subtle discomfort, a micro-emptiness, a twitch of restlessness. In the old life, you would immediately medicate it. Scroll, snack, message, fantasize, consume. But in solitude, you pause long enough to see the moment of choice. This is where alchemy becomes daily practice, Jung would say. When the unconscious becomes conscious, fate becomes choice. The compulsion loosens. The inner image replaces the reflex. You start asking, what is this urge trying to protect me from? Sometimes it's grief. Sometimes it's fear of failure. Sometimes it's the terror of being nobody. The habit is not your enemy. It's a clumsy guardian. And Rumi would insist, don't shame the guardian. Invite it closer. The way you tame a wild animal is not with punishment, but with steady attention. He tells stories where a thief becomes a saint, not because someone beat him into goodness, but because someone saw the hunger beneath his stealing. So you don't delete bad habits like files. You transmute them. You take the same energy, craving, agitation, longing, and refine it into devotion, craft, discipline, prayer, study, creation. This is where the Red Book becomes essential. Jung didn't theorize solitude. He underwent it. He let the inner world become a living terrain, and he recorded what happened when he stopped treating symbols as mere imagination. The psyche, once respected, begins to cooperate. In that cooperation, something strange appears. Guidance, not always pleasant, often unsettling, but precise. You might feel pulled to clean your room, to stop a certain friendship, to change your sleep, to return to an old craft, to walk every day without headphones. These seem small, even banal, but they are the psyche reordering your life to match a deeper pattern. Attar would call this the valley of detachment, not renouncing the world, but renouncing the addiction to the world. You stop demanding that people, dopamine, or status carry the weight of your meaning. And here is the twist modern audiences rarely hear. Solitude doesn't make you less connected. It makes you more capable of connection. Because now you can be with others without turning them into medicine. You can love without consuming. You can speak without performing. The inner cave produces a different kind of human being. Someone who can sit with discomfort without immediately turning it into a purchase, a post, or a panic. And then comes the red phase. Rubedo. The stage many never reach because it requires a decision. The earlier stages are inward, breaking, cleansing, integrating. Rubedo demands incarnation, bringing the inner gold back into the world. Alchemy, Sigold, is not a private spiritual trophy. It's living substance. It wants expression. Jung noticed that individuation completes itself through creativity. Writing, art, building, teaching, making something real that carries the stamp of the transformed psyche. Rumi is the perfect example. After his rupture, he didn't become a quiet monk. He became a furnace that sang. His grief did not remain grief. It turned into movement, whirling, dictation, story, metaphor, endless fire poured into language. The Masnavi is not only poetry, it's what happens when loneliness is metabolized. So Rubedo looks like this. The same solitude that once felt like exile becomes a workshop. You wake earlier. You protect silence. You stop negotiating with your phone. You choose one practice and return to it daily like prayer. The energy that fed addiction now feeds creation. And slowly, without announcing it, You become someone else, not improved, but aligned, less reactive, more inwardly governed. The world doesn't control you as easily because you have an inner center that can be purchased. But rubido contains a test. What will you do with the stone? Keep it hidden as a secret superiority, or use it as service? Mythology calls this the hero's return. The one who went into the underworld must come back with something for the village. The Sufi map names this explicitly. After fana, the dissolving of the ego, comes baka, abiding in the world, but no longer owned by it. You return to ordinary life, work, relationships, errands, noise. Yet something is different. You carry an inner quiet that doesn't depend on circumstances. Jung returned too. After his inner confrontation, he resumed practice, wrote, taught, formed a school. But he did it from a changed axis. He had learned that the psyche is not a side effect of life. It is life's hidden core. So the initiated person becomes a strange paradox, alone even in a crowd, but not lonely, private in their depth, but generous in their presence. They stop seeking constant stimulation because the inner world has become vivid. They stop needing to prove themselves because they have met the self, the quiet authority beneath persona. And when they speak to others, they don't preach. They transmit. They say, without words, it, survivable. The cave will not kill you. It will forge you. Now we can name the real enemy, not loneliness, but the refusal to be alone consciously. The modern world suffers from endless social contact and almost zero solitude. We are surrounded, yet internally fragmented. We can message anyone instantly, yet we cannot sit with our own mind for 10 minutes without craving escape. That is why loneliness becomes so violent today. Not because it is stronger, but because we are less trained. We never developed the inner companion. We never built the cave of the heart the Sufis describe, the place where the beloved is recognized as presence, not theory. So the practice is not dramatic. It's procedural. It looks like small vows. 1 hour a day without input. A walk with no device. A journal where you record recurring symbols and moods. A weekly desert night where you don't chase comfort. A replacement ritual. When the urge hits, breathe, write 1 paragraph, do 10 minutes of craft, pray, stretch. Something that converts energy instead of wasting it. This is how paradigms break, not by a single revelation, but by repeated contact with reality. Loneliness becomes a lab. Solitude becomes a teacher. And bad habits, once seen as you, become mere residue from an older identity you no longer inhabit. So we end where we began, at a ruined tower above a caravan road, where a man wrote love letters to absence. But now we understand the secret. The letters were not for a human beloved. They were for the missing center in himself, the part that only appears when the noise dies. Loneliness, in this alchemical sense, is not a curse you must cure. It is a door you must learn to enter. On the other side is not endless isolation, but a different kind of communion. The communion of a person who no longer needs to be rescued from themselves. Jung wrote in his memoir that loneliness is simply having no people around, but being unable to communicate what matters most. And yet, what if the most important things can be communicated as information? What if they must be embodied in how you keep your attention, how you hold your impulses, how you build your days, how you respond to pain without immediately purchasing relief? Rumi says it cleanly. Let yourself be silently drawn by what you really love. That strange pull toward quiet, toward the inner cave, is not the soul giving up. It is the soul remembering its home. So take this question with you. What if your loneliness is not the problem, but the initiation? What if the habit you can break is simply the false self fighting the furnace? And if you choose tonight to stay just a little longer in the silence, you may discover what the 30 birds discovered. You were never separate. You were becoming.